Hi everyone and welcome to this new video in which I will continue my web exploitation series. In the previous video I discussed how to enumerate files and directories, so it was the first video of the enumeration portion of the course. In this video instead we will learn how to enumerate virtual hosts. So I will explain what are exactly virtual hosts and how we can enumerate them and why enumeration of virtual hosts is an important process of web exploitation. So to play with virtual host enumeration, I developed a Docker environment similar to the one developed for the previous video where I showed how to enumerate files and directories. So for this time we also have a Docker environment, but the Nginx server has been configured differently to allow for virtual host enumeration. So to run the environment, you just have to do a docker compose app once you have this file. Of course, before you have to build the image. So this is the image in the Docker file. This is the instruction of the image. And then we're gonna build it with docker build -t. You put the name of the image and then you put a dot. And this is gonna take the Docker file in the current directory, which is the Docker directory in my case. So right now everything is in the Docker directory. You do the build with the dot so that it takes the Docker file from that directory. Of course, in this case, it immediately built the image because I already built it. In your case, it will take some time, but after the image has been built, you can just use the Docker compose. You can do Docker compose app and it will automatically take this Docker compose YAML, this .yml file, and then you can do Docker compose app and it runs the lab. Now to actually access the machine, you have to do a final thing, and essentially you have to add in the etc host file, you have to add a line that binds the 127.0.0.1 IP address with the local name. So this is important, you have to do this. So the idea is that by modifying this etc/host with this line, so you add this line to this file, you are associating the IP address 127.0.0.1, which is the IP address for localhost, to this specific name, which is not localhost, as we show in the previous episode, but this time is just code local. And you can imagine, for example, if you are doing a box for OSCP or a box for ActedBox, you will be given an IP address and the name of the box. So you can do like machine name, machine.htb, or like for OSCP, like machine.oscp, something like that. So you will be given such domain, and you have to put such domain into the etc host to have the association between IP name and domain name. So you have to do this. Once you do that, so once you are able to ping it, you can just do a ping local to check that it works, and in this case it works. And so essentially you have to go with the browser to this specific host. So this is the host, HTTP with local, and the port is 1337. So you put this in your browser and you're good to go. You see the website and you're able to do this laboratory. So once we go into this local port 1337, we are welcome with this web application. It's a simple HTML page. It's a static page that says welcome. This is a simple landing page. You shall find nothing useful here. And notice that I was able to reach this site because this local is registered in my etc host, in my local etc host, which allows the web browser to resolve this domain name. Local is a domain name, and it resolves to the IP address 127.0.0.1 port, and then I put the port, and the port is 1337. So once I put all this data, I'm able to access the service, which in this case is a very simple web application. Now, what's the idea behind virtual host enumeration? Because in this case we have this application, and if we check the source code, we find nothing of interest. Now at this point you could start to enumerate files and directory with gobuster as I showed in the previous example. However, in this example you will find nothing useful like that, because I've made sure that you could not find anything useful by just enumerating files and directories. And indeed, if you actually go to the source of this web server, you go to www.html, Here, there's nothing. There's just a static index.html page, which is the one that we are seeing here rendered by the browser. So nothing useful can come from enumerating files and directories. At this point, the question is, what is there to enumerate other than files and directories? And here we come with the concept of virtual host. Now, virtual host is a mechanism that was introduced in HTTP, if I remember well, in HTTP 1.1. So it is the version HTTP/1.1. And the main idea behind virtual host is the following one. Suppose that you have a web server. So for example, you want to host your application and they give you a machine. They give you a server on the internet and this server has a certain IP address. So you have an IP. And this IP is accessible from the various clients. So here you have the various clients. All of them are connected to the internet and your server is also connected to the internet with a specific IP address. And maybe you have port 80 or like let's say port 1337. So you have port 1337 TCP. So TCP port 1337, you have a web server listening for incoming connection. So each client that wants to access your web application, what does it do? It goes to this IP address at this port with this protocol, with the TCP protocol, and it gets access to your web application. And this is good. However, they realize at some point, the people who engineer this sort of stuff, they realize that this means that just with this, to have a single web application, I need to allocate an IP address and a TCP port. So I need both resources for just one web application. And this can be very limiting. It can be very limiting if you want, for example, to host 2 different web applications, not just one. What would you have to do to host 2 different web applications? Well, maybe you can keep the IP the same, but you have to choose a different port. Maybe you do 1338 as a different port, so not 1337, because that's already allocated for one web application. You have to use a different port, and this means also spawning a different process that takes care of this different web application. At some point, people realized that there should be an easier way to offer multiple web applications with the same IP port. So the idea is that I want to keep the same IP and the same port. However, I want to offer multiple web applications. How can I do that? And this is where the idea of virtual host comes in. Notice the word, it's called host, but it's not just a simple host. It's called a virtual host. So we are trying to virtualize the concept of hosting. To host means to just give some service, just to put a web application that is able to handle some request. So to virtualize this, what does it mean? It means from the same machine with the same IP port connection, I should be able to offer multiple web applications, not just one. I should be able to offer Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, maybe even thousands of web applications, depending of course on the characteristic of the server. And the idea is that a single process, by also using multi-threaded techniques, but the idea is that a single process can receive a request here and then can redirect the request to the appropriate web application. Now, how do you do this redirection? And this is where the concept of the host header comes in. So let's open Burp and let's analyze some requests that are made with Burp. So as usual, I have here on the left Burp and on the right my browser that proxies every request to Burp. Here I'm gonna intercept on, so I'm intercepting all the traffic. Here I get something about Google, we don't care about that. And now I'm gonna make a request to my website. Now notice the various headers of this request. We get the typical get, the verb, then the resource, the slash, which means the root page. Then we have the HTTP version, which is 1.1, and then we find this host header. And notice that the host header says leonardotamiano.xyz. And then we have a bunch of other headers. Now the key idea of for understanding virtual host enumeration is the role played by this host header. And we will discuss why shortly. So let's just forward this to the browser. We forward other request, and then we get this main page. Now let's try to intercept the request that it's made when I go to the blog. So notice here, the host is no longer just leonardodamiano.xyz, but rather it's blog.leonardodamiano.xyz. So the idea here is that I'm using a different virtual host, because the value that we put into this host header is exactly the virtual host that we want to use. Now, when I make a request to this virtual host, I go into entire different applications. So here, for example, is where I have my technical blog. However, I have other virtual hosts. For example, I have the teaching virtual host, where I uploaded some old teaching material where I did some lecture at university. So notice here, the request that is made to the web server is no longer blog.leonardodamiano.xyz, but rather it is teaching.leonardodamiano.xyz. So what's the idea here? Well, the idea here is that if we simply do a request like this, so let's try to do follow redirection. Okay, if you just do a request like this, we only see one specific web application. However, there might be other web application that we just do not see. Why? Because we do not have the right virtual host set up. When we set the right virtual host in the host header, we might get access to new virtual host. So for example, here if I put blog.leonardodamiano.xyz, I get a different web application, I get the blog. While if I put teaching, I get the teaching virtual host with a different web application, with the teaching material. So essentially, this is the basic idea behind virtual host. Virtual host is a mechanism that is introduced at the HTTP layer that allows me to have multiple web applications hosted under the same couple IP port. So my web server running on my VPS is listening on the 443 port with the same IP. However, by changing the virtual host parameter, which is found in the host header, I'm able to access different web applications. And all of this is configured, for example, in my case, with Nginx, but you can also have Apache, Tomcat, and all different web servers. Essentially, they support the idea of virtual host, they support the concept of virtual host, and each of them a little bit different, but all of them allow you to specify different virtual hosts and allow you to configure how that particular virtual host behaves. But this is the general idea. Now, if we go back to our application, so this one essentially, the problem is, okay, in this application there seems to be nothing here. And here we have the Docker running. In this application there seems to be nothing. However, there might be information put in other virtual hosts. So to make sure that there really isn't anything useful, we have to do virtual host enumeration. So here, once again, the idea of enumeration comes in. Remember that to enumerate means to list out all the valid possibilities, to list out all the particular hostname that works. In the case of files and directories enumeration, the idea was to discover all the specific files and directories that were exposed by the web server. In this case, it's the same exact idea, but instead of focusing with the files and directories, we are focusing with the virtual host. So the idea behind virtual host enumeration is to discover exactly what are all the virtual hosts that are exposed by the web application. And as always, what is the problem here? The problem here is that unless I know prior to the testing what is the virtual host, I have no clue what could possibly be the virtual host exposed by the application. So to approximate this research in a way, to approximate this search, the idea is to use word list. So now the problem is, okay, how do I test for virtual host? And as we saw, it was pretty simple actually. I just start from the basic domain that I want to test for the presence of virtual host. So for example, in this case, it could be leonardodamiano.xyz. I start from this, and then here I put the virtual host I want to test. So for example, teaching gives me a new virtual host, but then I could have like something else, and in this case the something else gave me a different virtual host, and so on and so forth. So this essentially is the idea. How do I do that? I just need to put my like try the virtual host I want to test for within this portion of the host. I need to send a request, and depending on the page that I get on the specific content, I'm able to understand, okay, I actually found a new application, or sometimes it happens that no new application are found, and so we get the same old application, which means that no new virtual host have been found. Now, of course, to help in this search, we can use word list, and they are extremely useful, and I've discussed about word lists also in the previous video, but this time we're gonna use word list specific for virtual host enumeration. And we can go into the GitHub of seclist. These are extremely popular word lists. We can go into discovery, into DNS, and here we have this subdomains top 1 million, subdomain top 1 million, this tree, which contains, I think this is like 5,000, 20,000, and 110,000, something like that. So there are a lot of domains. So for example, this is the 5,000 one. So we have www, mail, FTP, localhost, webmail. So these are all the various domains that, for example, have to be added to the domain we're testing. So if our base domain is local, then we're gonna do www.local, and then after that mail.local, and then after that localhost.local, and so on and so forth. So this is the basic idea. Now, of course, there are tools that help us automate this, and the tool we will use in this video is gonna be gobuster. I've already discussed gobuster in the previous video, so I will not talk too much about it. But the idea is that this time we're gonna use gobuster in the virtual host mode, so vhost mode. Now, how do I get this word list? We can just go into row here. We can go into row, we can get the URL, and then we can either do wget or curl. So in this case I did wget, and I have the subdomains. I can put the subdomains into the word list directory, and then here in the word list I have this word list saved. Now to use gobuster, what do? We do gobuster vhost for the virtual host mode. Then I have to use www.wordlist --wordlist, and I put word list and then directory. Then I do -u for the URL, and I put http://local1237, and then most importantly I have to put an extra here option at the start. I have to say append domain. Now in old version of gobuster this was not needed, but what is the idea? This option changes the way that this word list is processed. Why? Because the idea is this: we start from this URL, and then for each domain that we find in this list, without the append domain, we would just put in the host header just the value contained into this word list. So if we have like dom1, dom2, dom3, etc. in this word list, without this flag, each HTTP request that would be made with host dom1, then host dom2, then host dom3. So you have to specify the entire domain within the word list. If instead we use this flag, the idea is that in the host field, it's gonna take the word from the word list, like dom1, but then it's gonna put a dot, and it's gonna append the domain we use in the URL. So dom1.local, then dom2.local. So the idea is that the word list is not the entire full specified domain, but rather is just the final part of the domain, the leftmost part of the domain. So I want to append this because in this word list, it's not specific to this specific machine. It's just the top level. It's just the most specific part of the domain, not the top level, but the most specific part of the domain. So if we just run this, what do we get? Notice what we get. I just said run, and we get found test.localhost, found dev.localhost, found prod.localhost. So it already found 3 different virtual hosts. Now, how do we check if this is correct? Well, we just go here essentially, and what do? We just copy this one, but here at the start, I'm gonna do test.local. Now, as you can see, when we try to go into the test.local1237, we got this error. So what's the problem here? The gobuster tool says that it found a domain, but the browser is not able to access the page. The issue here has to do with two different protocols, which is the HTTP protocol and the DNS protocol. Now, the problem that the browser is encountering has nothing to do with HTTP and virtualhost, but rather it has to do with the domain name system, with the DNS system. Now, why do we use DNS? Well, the idea of DNS is to start from a domain name such as test.local and to resolve this domain name into an IP address. So for example, in this case, the IP address should be 127.0.0.1. Now the problem is that we know this is the case for this example, but the browser does not know. Because when the browser tries to resolve this name is not written anywhere. It is not written on the internet, it is not written in our local machine, so it is simply not able to resolve this particular host. How do we fix this? Well, remember that initially we put into the etc host, we put the line which says, look, local is associated to 127.0.0.1. So we have to edit this file and we have to add that, look, not only local, but also test.local is associated to this IP address. Okay, now I edited the file and essentially in the same line as before, I also added test.local, dev.local and prod.local. Now, if we refresh the page, what is happening is that the browser is checking the etc host for the DNS resolution. The DNS host says, look, this is the IP address, so the browser knows the IP and port to connect to where there is a web server. At that point, the web server receives an HTTP request where the host header has the value test.local. And now Nginx comes in and it says, okay, I have this specific virtual host, I'm gonna give you this specific page, testing environment, which is different from the initial page, from this welcome page. This is a specific page that is only available from this virtual host, from the testing virtual host. And if you go into dev, so if you go into, for example, dev.local, we see development environment. And if we go into the prod.local, we see production environment. So essentially we have three different environments, each of which has a different virtual host, but all of them are within the same web server. So the web server can route the traffic through this different web application using the host header, using this virtual host mechanism. And this is why it's called virtual host, because it is virtualizing the idea of hosting. I don't have a single web application now listening on a given IP and port. I can have many different web applications on the same IP and port, and sort of to multiplex this channel to allow for multiple applications to exist on the same IP and port, I need an extra information so that when an HTTP message is received by the same IP port combination, within this HTTP we have the host header value, so this value, which is used to route the message into the proper web application. And this is responsibility of the web server. Now, of course, the idea here are these all the virtual hosts that there are? And the thing is that it's actually not the case. Why? Well, let's open Burp for a moment, right? So we open Burp, and here we can go into the Chromium that we use for, not this one that we use with the proxy. And then, actually, let's go into Chromium. We copy this here, and we just intercept this, right? So we're gonna intercept this, So we have this prod, and then I put to repeater, perfect. So we have this. Now, we just play with Burp. Here I put, for example, test, and I get testing environment. I put dev, and I get development environment. And actually, there is a pre-prod environment, which has this particular virtual host. So it's pre-prod, and it is the pre-production environment. Now, of course, since this value was not present in the word list that we used, we did not find it. gobuster did not give us this virtual host. And here the idea is to learn that depending on the quality of your word list, and of course on the specific application that you're trying to attack, on the specific web server that you're trying to attack, you can have more or less results. So it is never 100% science that you can always guarantee you will find the right virtual host. It is a bit of an art. You have to have a good word list, you have to have a lot of tries, a lot of like processing power to discover these kind of things. It's not the most beautiful thing, but it is necessary to know how it works. And so we arrive at the conclusion of this video. In this video, I wanted to talk about virtual host enumeration, and the basic idea is that the value that we put into this host header is extremely important. Notice what happens if we remove it. If we remove it, the Nginx server says bad request. I need to know the virtual host, otherwise I'm not able to route the information to the right application. I can remove almost everything else, I believe. Yes, I can remove everything else, but I need the verb, the resource, the HTTP protocol, and the host header. I do need the host header since the introduction of virtual host, which happened with HTTP 1.1. Now, to finish off the video, one might ask, okay, but what is the difference between virtual host and DNS? Because they both seem to be like domain names, right? So this is a virtual host, but it can also be a domain name, a name in the DNS system. Well, the difference is that even though they might seem the same sort of data, because they look the same, so this test.local can play two roles. It can be a virtual host, vhost, or it can be a domain name in the DNS system. So the difference is exactly this. What is this data used for? Because in the domain name system, this is used to associate this name to an IP address. So if you are using this name to have a mapping between a symbolic name and an IP address, then this is a domain name. It's a name in the domain name system. Otherwise, if we are using this value to understand to which application we have to route the HTTP request, then we are not any longer doing the mapping between symbolic name and IP address, but rather we are doing the mapping between HTTP request and web application. And this is done through the virtual host system. So we have a host header and we want to assign to that host header a specific web application. So even though these things might look the same, they are used in different contexts, and you need to understand if you want to enumerate DNS names or virtual host. To enumerate virtual host, you need to send different requests and you need to change the host field in all those requests. By changing the host field, you might get access to new application. So for example, this is production environment. I change this host field and I get access to the development environment. I change it again and I get access to the testing environment. I keep it the same. I put something that does not exist and I'm back to the welcome page. And indeed, as a last thing, what is going on with gobuster after all? If we route the traffic of gobuster through our proxy with a proxy flag, so we have to do HTTP with a proxy flag. If you do this, notice here we're gonna get a lot of requests. And here he's gonna say, look, I found a lot of virtual hosts, but this is actually not the case. It's just because gobuster is being full by the burp suite endpoint. But the idea is that look the request that we are making. So for example, in this case, we are making a request to local, so it's just local. Then here we're making a request to this hexadecimal.local, here to localhost.local, here to ftp.local, here to cpanel.local, here to mail.local. So it just keeps on going. At some point, we make the request to dev.local, and this point we get something back, and so on and so forth. At some point, we make the other request. So he did not do it in time here, but essentially at some point we will make the request to prod.local, to dev.local, to test.local, and so on and so forth. And so to finish off the video completely, this is the command you need to remember. It's gobuster in virtual host enumeration mode. You want to append the domain. Then you want to pick a good word list. For example, this is okay. It doesn't have too many entries. You can also use the ones with a lot more entries. And then you put the URL. So remember that the URL, you have to put exactly the entire URL with the top level domain. So in my case, it was simply local. If you're doing a machine out of the box, it's going to be machine.htb. If you're doing a machine OSCP, I think it's gonna be like machine.oscp maybe, something like that. I do not remember the top level domain of machines in OSCP, but that's the general idea. You put the entire domain here, and it will add the domains present in the word list like this. So in the first section, it's gonna add the domain, and then it's gonna put exactly what you put in the URL. And with this, you should be able to enumerate the virtual host. I hope the video was interesting. If it was so, please leave some feedback in the comments, and to the next video.